Hello everyone and welcome back to Shadow Man Stories. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Thomas Blackthorne, and I've been a park ranger in the George Washington National Forest for 14 years. That's long enough to know every trail, every cave, and every danger these Virginia mountains can throw at you. My family's been in these hills for 3 generations. My grandfather worked the coal mines before they played out, and my daddy taught me to track and hunt before I could tie my own boots. I patrol the Copperhead Ridge area, which sits about 35 miles from the nearest real town. It's wild country up here, full of limestone caves and old mine shafts that most folks don't even know exist. The ridge got its name from all the copperhead snakes that used to sun themselves on the rocks, though you don't see many anymore. Something about the place seems to keep animals away these days. My specialty is wildlife disease control and backcountry patrol. That means I check on hikers, make sure nobody's camping where they shouldn't, and keep an eye out for sick animals that might spread disease. It's good work, honest work, and it keeps me close to the land my family's always called home. But there's something about Copperhead Ridge that's always felt wrong to me. Maybe it's because of what happened back in 1924, when the old Black Rock mine collapsed and killed 47 men. They never did recover all the bodies, said the shaft was too unstable to dig out. The mine company just sealed it up and walked away, leaving those poor souls buried under tons of rock and coal. Or maybe it's because of what happened to my little brother Jake 5 years ago. Jake was 28 then, a good hunter and better tracker than me. He knew these woods like the back of his hand. So when they found his truck parked at the old mining road with his rifle still in the rack and no sign of him anywhere, it didn't make sense. The sheriff called it a hunting accident, said Jake must have fallen into one of the old mine shafts. But they never found his body, and that truck was parked nowhere near any known shaft. I searched for weeks, followed every trail, checked every cave I could find. Nothing. It was like my brother just vanished into thin air. The old-timers around here had their own ideas about what happened to Jake. They talked about the Hollow folks, strange mountain families that lived way back in the deepest parts of the forest. Folks who'd gotten so isolated they weren't quite right in the head anymore. Said they'd snatch people sometimes, drag them back to their hidden settlements. I never put much stock in those stories. Seemed to me the Hollow folk were just inbred families hiding from the law, maybe running moonshine or growing marijuana back in the hollers where nobody would think to look. But after Jake disappeared, I started wondering if there might be something to it. The Cherokee who used to live in these mountains had their own stories too. They talked about the Nunahai spirit people who lived inside the mountains and could appear as regular humans when they wanted to. According to the stories, the Nunahai would sometimes take people to live with them forever. Most folks dismissed that as old superstition, but I'd learned to respect Cherokee wisdom about these mountains. October of 1976 was when everything changed. We had an early cold snap that year, with frost hitting the trees before they'd even finished turning. A thick fog rolled into the valleys and just sat there for days, making the whole forest feel closed in and wrong. You couldn't see 20 feet in front of you down in the hollers, and the fog had a smell to it like old metal and something rotten. I was doing my weekly patrol on a Tuesday morning when I came across the campsite, 3 tents set up neat and proper in a clearing about 6 miles from the nearest trail. The fire was still smoking, and when I checked the camp stove, it was still warm. Looked like someone had been cooking breakfast eggs and bacon in the pan, coffee pot still hot to the touch. But there wasn't a soul in sight. I called out, thinking maybe the campers had gone to get water or answer nature's call. "Hello, park ranger here. Everything okay?" My voice echoed off the trees and died in that thick fog. No answer came back. That's when I noticed how quiet it was. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, no wind in the trees. Just dead silence, like the whole forest was holding its breath. That's when I knew something was very, very wrong. I pulled out my radio to call for backup, but all I got was static. The fog seemed to mess with radio signals, happened sometimes in these mountains. I made a note to check on the campers again on my way back and started documenting the scene with my camera. 3 tents, all in good condition. 3 sleeping bags laid out neat inside. 3 backpacks with gear that looked expensive and well-maintained. These weren't rookie campers, they had good equipment and knew how to set up a proper site. But where were they? I walked the perimeter of the camp, looking for tracks. Found them easy enough: 3 sets of hiking boots, different sizes. One smaller set that probably belonged to a woman, 2 larger ones for men. The tracks were clear in the soft earth around the camp, but here's what made my skin crawl. They all headed in the same direction, walking in a perfectly straight line toward the old mining area. Not the kind of line people walk naturally when they're hiking together. People wander a bit, step around rocks and trees, spread out to talk. These tracks looked like 3 people walking in single file, each step placed exactly where it needed to be, heading straight toward something with purpose. I followed the tracks about a quarter mile before they led me to something that made me stop cold. There was a mine entrance in the hillside that I'd never seen before, and I'd been patrolling this area for 14 years. The entrance was maybe 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, carved into the limestone like someone had used dynamite to blast it out. Old wooden supports held up the opening, but they looked wrong somehow, too new for a mine that should have been sealed since the 1920 seconds, but too weathered for something recent. I checked my maps. According to everything I had, there shouldn't be any mine entrance here. The Blackrock mine was supposed to be 2 miles northeast, and it was supposed to be sealed. But there were those 3 sets of tracks, leading straight into the dark. I pulled out my flashlight and my backup batteries, made sure my radio was working even if I couldn't reach base, and started into the mine. Standard procedure said I should wait for backup, but if there were people trapped or injured in there, every minute counted. The tunnel sloped down into the hill, and the air got colder with every step. My breath started fogging up, which was strange because it had been a warm morning. The walls were solid limestone, carved smooth by years of mining work. I could see pick marks in the stone, and here and there, old coal veins that had been followed and abandoned. About 50 feet in, I found the first boot. It was a hiking boot, expensive leather, size 8. A woman's boot. But when I picked it up, coal dust poured out of it like black sand. At the bottom of the boot, mixed in with the coal dust, were small white fragments that looked suspiciously like bone. I set the boot down carefully and took a picture. This was evidence now, and I was dealing with something a lot more serious than lost hikers. That's when I heard the voices. They were coming from deeper in the mine, echoing off the stone walls. Men's voices, calling out like they were working. I could hear the ring of pickaxes against stone, the scrape of shovels, the creak of wooden supports. It sounded like a full mining operation going on down there. "Hello," I called out. "Park Ranger, are you folks okay?" The sound stopped, complete silence for maybe 10 seconds. Then one voice called back. "Help us, we're trapped." It was a man's voice, but something about it wasn't right. The words were clear enough, but they seemed to echo in a way that made them sound hollow, like they were coming from the bottom of a well. I moved deeper into the mine, following the sound. My flashlight beam started getting dimmer, even though I'd put in fresh batteries that morning. I stopped and tried my backup flashlight. Same thing, the beam barely reached 10 feet ahead of me. "Where are you?" I called out. "Down here," came the answer. "Hurry." I kept walking, but now I was starting to notice other things. The air smelled wrong, like coal dust and something rotten, something that had been dead for a long time. The temperature kept dropping until I could see my breath clearly, and the voices, when they called out again, sounded strange. Old-fashioned somehow, like the way my grandfather used to talk. "Please, mister, we need help." That one made me stop completely. Nobody talks like that anymore, not unless they're really old or putting on an act. And there was something else about the voice, something familiar that I couldn't quite place. I found the second boot, another 20 feet down the tunnel. Men's size 11, also filled with coal dust and bone fragments. This one had something else in it too, a piece of paper. I pulled it out carefully and unfolded it. It was a newspaper clipping, yellow with age. The headline read, 47 miners killed in Blackrock disaster, bodies lost in collapsed shaft. The date was the 15th of October, 1924. My hands started shaking as I read the article. It described how a gas explosion had brought down half the mine, trapping 47 men in the tunnels. The mine company had tried for 3 days to dig them out, but more cave-ins kept happening. Finally, they'd given up and sealed the whole thing, leaving the bodies where they lay. But this newspaper clipping was in a modern hiking boot, in a mine that wasn't supposed to exist, following tracks from campers who'd disappeared this morning. "Mr. Ranger." The voice came again, closer now. "We can see your light. Come help us." I looked up from the newspaper clipping and nearly dropped my flashlight. There was a pale figure standing in the tunnel ahead of me, just at the edge of my light. He was wearing mining clothes, canvas pants, a worn shirt, and a metal helmet with a lamp on it. But his skin was white as cave limestone, and his eyes were black as coal. "Please," he said, and his voice was the voice of a dead man. "We've been waiting so long." That's when I started backing up. The figure in the mining gear didn't move like a living person. When I backed away, he followed with jerky, puppet-like motions, like someone was pulling his strings. His feet didn't make any sound on the stone floor, and when my flashlight beam hit him directly, he looked translucent, like fog shaped into the form of a man. "Don't go, Ranger," he said, and now I could see that his mouth didn't move right when he talked. "We need your help. We've been trapped so long." I kept backing up, trying to keep my light on him while feeling behind me for the tunnel wall. That's when I heard the other voices, coming from side tunnels I hadn't noticed on the way in. "Help us. So cold down here. Been waiting." More figures started appearing at the edges of my vision. Pale men in mining clothes, all of them moving with that same wrong, jerky motion. Some carried spectral pickaxes that glowed with a sick green light. Others had shovels or lanterns that gave off no warmth. I counted at least a dozen of them, maybe more. They were coming from passages that shouldn't exist, moving to cut off my escape route. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. The first figure tilted his head, and I heard his neck bones crack. "We're the boys from Black Rock," he said. "Been working down here since 24, always looking for new crew members." That's when I saw him. Jake was standing behind 3 other miners, wearing the same canvas pants and mining helmet as the rest. But I'd know my little brother anywhere, even with skin white as bone and eyes black as coal pits. "Hey there, Tommy," Jake said, and his voice was exactly the same as I remembered, except hollow and echoing. "I've been waiting for you to find me." My legs nearly gave out. I'd searched for Jake for months after he disappeared. I'd followed every trail, checked every cave, interviewed every person who might have seen him. And here he was, standing in a mine that shouldn't exist, dressed like a miner from 50 years before he was born. "Jake," I whispered. "What happened to you?" "Same thing that's going to happen to you," he said, and started walking toward me with that awful jerky motion. "Don't worry, Tommy. It doesn't hurt after the first day. And we're never lonely down here, never cold neither." The other miners were closing in from all sides now. I could see them more clearly in my failing flashlight beam, men with caved-in chests and broken necks, men with pick handles sticking out of their skulls, men whose eyes had been replaced with lumps of coal. The cave-in hadn't killed them clean. It had trapped them and let them die slow, and somehow something had kept them from staying dead. "The mountain called us," one of them said, his voice like wind through a graveyard. "Called us to work, called us to stay. Now it's calling you." I felt something brush against my shoulder and spun around. There was a tunnel opening behind me that definitely hadn't been there before, and more pale figures were emerging from it. I was surrounded. My radio crackled to life suddenly, startling everyone. Through the static, I could hear the supervisor's voice. "Blackthorn, come in. What's your status?" I grabbed the radio and keyed the mic. "Base, this is Blackthorn. I'm in trouble. I'm in a mine on Copperhead Ridge with..." The radio died with a sound like breaking glass. "No one can help you now," Jake said, and he was close enough that I could smell the coal dust and decay on him. "No one even knows where you are. Just like me. Just like them." He pointed to 3 figures standing off to the side, and I realized with horror that they were the missing campers. They were already starting to look pale and translucent, their hiking clothes fading into mining gear. "How?" I asked. "We call to them," said the first miner. "Call them in their dreams. Call them when they're alone in the woods. Show them lights in the forest, voices asking for help. People always want to help. That's what makes them easy to catch." The temperature in the tunnel was dropping fast now. I could see ice crystals forming on the walls, and my breath was coming out in thick white clouds. The miners weren't bothered by the cold. They didn't seem to feel anything at all. The mountain feeds on life, another one explained. Feeds on warmth and breath and beating hearts. But it can't take them by force. Has to be given freely, has to be chosen. So we help, Jake said, and for just a moment, his voice sounded sad and human. We call to people. Show them things that make them want to come into the mountain. Make them choose to walk into the dark. I realized what they were doing. They weren't just dead miners, they were recruiters. Hunters. They found people alone in the woods and tricked them into entering the mines, where something old and hungry was waiting. I won't do it, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I won't help you hunt people. Jake's face changed, becoming less human and more like a mask carved from stone. You don't get to choose anymore, Tommy. None of us do. The mountain chose us. Now we serve the mountain. The miners started closing in, and I could feel the cold radiating off them like heat from a furnace. Wherever they touched me, I knew I'd start to freeze. Start to die. Start to become like them. I had maybe 10 seconds before they reached me. That's when I remembered my training. In ranger school, they teach you about mine safety. Old mines are dangerous not just because of cave-ins, but because of gas pockets and structural weaknesses. The wooden supports in these tunnels were old and rotted, and I'd noticed cracks in the ceiling where water had been seeping through. I pulled out my emergency flare. Every ranger carries them for signaling, and held it up. "Stay back," I shouted. "This whole place is unstable." The miners stopped, but not because they were afraid of the flare. They were staring at the red light like it was something they'd never seen before. "Pretty," one of them whispered. "Warm." That's when I understood. They'd been in the dark for so long they'd forgotten what light looked like, what warmth felt like. The flare was mesmerizing them the way a candle flame mesmerizes a moth. But Jake was different. He shook his head like he was clearing cobwebs and looked at me with something that might have been his old personality showing through. "Tommy," he said, and this time his voice sounded almost normal. "You have to get out of here. You have to run." "Come with me," I said. "We can both get out." He laughed, and it was the saddest sound I'd ever heard. "I can't leave, Tommy. None of us can. We're part of the mountain now. But you still have a choice." The other miners were starting to move again, the spell of the flare breaking. I could see hunger in their coal-black eyes, and I knew they weren't going to let me walk away. "How do I stop this?" I asked Jake. "You can't stop it," he said, "but you can slow it down. The main support beam, over there." He pointed to a thick wooden post that seemed to be holding up a large section of the tunnel ceiling. "It's rotted through. One good hit, and this whole section comes down." I looked where he was pointing and saw what he meant. The beam was cracked and sagging, held up more by habit than by strength. If it fell, it would bring down tons of rock and seal this part of the mine. "But you'll be trapped," I said. "We're already trapped," Jake replied. "Have been for 5 years. But if you seal this tunnel, we can't get out to hunt anymore. Can't call to people in the woods." The other miners realized what we were talking about and started moving faster. Their jerky motions became more fluid, more urgent. "Do it, Tommy," Jake shouted. "Do it now." I lit another flare and threw it at the support beam. The ancient wood caught fire immediately, burning with a bright orange flame that made the miners shriek and cover their eyes. The beam started to sag and crack. "Run!" Jake yelled, and for a moment he sounded exactly like my little brother again. I ran. Behind me I could hear the groaning and cracking of old wood giving way. The miners were screaming now, not in pain but in rage, knowing they were about to be cut off from the world above. I could hear Jake's voice among them, but he wasn't screaming. He was laughing. The tunnel shook, and rocks started falling from the ceiling. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, following my own footsteps back toward the entrance. My flashlight had died completely, but the burning support beam behind me provided enough light to see by. The cave-in started just as I reached the entrance. A rumbling sound like thunder filled the mine, and a blast of dusty air knocked me forward into the daylight. I tumbled down the hill outside the mine entrance and looked back just in time to see the whole opening collapse in on itself. Rocks and debris poured down the hillside, sealing the tunnel completely. When the dust settled, there was no sign that a mine entrance had ever existed there. Just a pile of broken stone and old timber. I sat there in the morning sunlight, breathing hard, and trying to make sense of what had happened. The fog was starting to lift from the forest, and I could hear birds singing again. Normal sounds, living sounds. My radio crackled back to life. "Blackthorn, come in. We've got a report of missing campers in your area." I keyed the mic with a shaking hand. "Base, this is Blackthorn. I found their campsite, but no sign of the campers. Looks like they might have fallen into an old mine shaft. I'm gonna need a recovery team." "Copy that. Are you okay? You sound shaken up." I looked back at the pile of rocks where the mine entrance had been. "I'm fine," I said. "Just tired. It's been a long morning." I filed my report that afternoon, sticking as close to the truth as I could without sounding insane. 3 campers missing, tracks leading to an unstable mine shaft, cave-in that sealed the entrance. The recovery team confirmed that the area was too dangerous to excavate. The missing campers were declared dead, victims of an unfortunate accident. I never mentioned the miners, or Jake, or the thing in the mountain that fed on life and warmth. Who would believe me? And more importantly, what good would it do? The tunnel was sealed, the immediate threat was over. But it wasn't really over, and I knew it. Over the next few weeks, I started researching the history of mining in these mountains more carefully. What I found made my blood run cold. The Black Rock disaster in 1924 wasn't the only cave-in that had claimed lives. There had been dozens of mining accidents over the years, dating back to the 1800s. Hundreds of men had died in these mountains, and many of their bodies had never been recovered. And there were other mine entrances. Lots of them. Most were supposed to be sealed, but I'd learned not to trust what the maps said. I started carrying more flares on my patrols. Started paying closer attention to missing person reports. 3 times in the past year, I've found campsites, like that first one, meals still warm, no sign of the people who'd been there. Each time, I've found tracks leading toward old mining areas. Each time, I've managed to get there before it was too late. The miners are still down there, in the deeper tunnels that my cave-in didn't reach. Still calling to people in the woods, still hunting for the mountain that feeds on life. But they're more careful now. They've learned that someone is watching, someone who knows what they are. The disappearances have slowed down, and when people do go missing, it's farther away from my patrol area. I think about Jake sometimes, wondering if any part of him is still down there in the dark, or if whatever I talked to that day was just the mountain wearing his face. I like to think that he helped me escape because some part of my little brother was still fighting against what he'd become. I'll be retiring from the Ranger Service in a few years. When I do, I'm going to make sure my replacement knows about the old mining areas, about the spots where campers shouldn't go alone, about the signs to watch for. I won't tell them the whole truth, they wouldn't believe me anyway, but I'll give them enough information to keep people safe. Because the mountain is still hungry, and the hollow men are still working in the dark, waiting for someone foolish enough to follow strange lights and distant voices into places where living people shouldn't go. My name is Thomas Blackthorn, and I've been keeping watch on Copperhead Ridge for 14 years. Someone has to. Someone has to stand between the darkness and the people who don't know it's there. Someone has to remember the men who died in these mountains, and make sure they don't take anyone else with them into the hollow places beneath the stone. The mountain is patient. It can wait decades for the right person to come along, someone curious enough or brave enough or foolish enough to walk into the dark when voices call for help. But I'm patient too, and as long as I'm drawing breath, I'll be here, watching and waiting and keeping the secret that keeps people alive. Even if it means my brother stays buried forever in the cold and the dark, with only the dead for company. Some sacrifices are worth making. Some doors should stay closed, and some stories should only be told to people who need to know why they should never, ever follow strange tracks into old mines, no matter how much the voices in the dark sound like someone who needs help. Trust me on that one. My name is Catherine Ironwood, and I've been a park ranger for 9 years. What I found on Devil's Backbone Ridge in March of 1983 changed everything I thought I knew about death. I work in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia, where the mountains roll like green waves and the hollows run deep with secrets. My job is protecting the old Cherokee burial sites scattered throughout these hills. Most people think it's boring work, hiking around, checking on some old graves, writing reports, They don't understand how personal it is for me. See, my great-great-grandmother was Cherokee. She walked the Trail of Tears in 1838 when the government forced her people west. But some of her family stayed behind, hidden in these mountains. I grew up hearing stories about them, about the sacred places they left behind. Getting this job felt like coming home. Devil's Backbone Ridge got its name from the way it cuts through the forest like a giant spine. It's a narrow trail with 400-foot drops on both sides. One wrong step, and you're tumbling down to the rocks below. The Cherokee called it something else, a word that meant, where the dead watch over the living. That March morning started like any other. I was doing my monthly check of Site 47, one of the protected burial grounds up on the ridge. The weather had been terrible, late winter mud season, when the snow melts and turns everything into slippery mess. Fog rolled through the trees like smoke, making it hard to see more than 20 feet ahead. I'd been walking for about an hour when I saw the vehicles. 2 university trucks parked at the old logging road that led to Site 47. That was strange. I hadn't gotten any paperwork about research permits. The burial sites were supposed to be off-limits without special approval. I hiked up the muddy trail, my boots squelching in the wet earth. The fog was getting thicker. I could hear water dripping from the trees, but underneath that was something else. A sound I couldn't quite place. When I reached the burial site, I stopped cold. Someone had been digging, a lot. The protected area looked like a construction zone. Shovels and screens and measuring tools were scattered around like someone had just dropped everything and walked away. A big hole had been carved into the side of the hill, right where the ground-penetrating radar had shown the oldest burials. But that wasn't the weird part. The weird part was how the bones were arranged. Cherokee burials are careful things. Bodies get laid to rest in specific ways, with certain items facing particular directions. What I saw didn't match any burial practice I knew about. Bones were set out in perfect spirals around the dig site. Skulls formed a neat circle around the excavation. Leg bones pointed inward like arrows. It looked like someone had arranged them that way on purpose. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" My voice echoed off the trees and died in the fog. No answer. I found a journal half buried in the mud near one of the trucks. The cover was soggy, but I could make out Dr. Martin Steele, written in black marker. I flipped it open. The first few pages were normal archaeological notes. Measurements, sketches, theories about the age of the site, but as I read further, the handwriting got messier, the notes got stranger. Day 12, bones seem to be moving overnight. Team thinks I'm imagining things. Day 15, Sarah swears she saw one of the skulls turn to look at her. Ridiculous, but can't shake the feeling we're being watched. Day 18, found burial chamber that shouldn't exist. Pre-Cherokee, much older. Something's wrong with this place. The last entry was from 5 days ago. Team wants to leave, won't listen to reason. The bone mother is real. She's waking up. I closed the journal and looked around the site again. In the growing fog, those spiral bone arrangements looked less like academic curiosity and more like warnings. That's when I noticed the silence. No birds. No insects. Even the dripping had stopped. The only sound was my own breathing and the beating of my heart. I'd spent years in these woods. I knew what natural quiet sounded like. This wasn't natural. This was the kind of silence that happens when everything alive decides to run away. I should have left then. Should have hiked back to my truck and called for backup. But I had a job to do. These were my ancestors' graves. If some university team had disturbed them and then just abandoned their mess, someone had to clean it up. I started taking pictures, documenting the site. Through my camera lens, something caught my eye near the tree line. A figure in the fog, too tall and too thin to be human. I lowered the camera. Nothing there. I raised it again, looked through the viewfinder. The figure was closer now. My hands started shaking. I'd been a ranger for 9 years. I knew these mountains better than anyone. There was no one else supposed to be up here. The nearest road was 25 miles away, and the trail was officially closed for mud season. But somebody was watching me from the trees, and they weren't moving like any person I'd ever seen. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was one of the archaeologists. Maybe they hadn't all left. Maybe Dr. Steele was still up here somewhere. "Hello?" I called out again. "Dr. Steele? I'm Catherine Ironwood, Park Service. We need to talk about this dig site. The figure in the fog stepped closer. Close enough that I could see it wasn't wearing any winter gear. No coat, no hat, nothing that made sense for March weather in the mountains. "Sir, are you okay? You must be freezing." Another step. The fog swirled around the figure like it was alive. I could see now that something was seriously wrong with the way it moved. Too stiff, too jerky, like a puppet with half its strings cut. I pulled out my radio. Tried to go call the ranger station. Nothing but static. That wasn't unusual. Up on the ridge, cell phones didn't work here either, but today it felt different, like something was blocking the signal on purpose. The figure emerged from the fog line. It was Dr. Martin Steele. I recognized him from the photo in his journal. Tall, thin, with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. But he looked wrong. His skin was too pale, almost blue-white. His clothes were caked with mud and something that looked like grave dirt. And his eyes were completely black. "Dr. Steele?" I took a step back. "Are you hurt? You look sick." He smiled. His teeth were stained brown, and when he opened his mouth, I smelled something awful, like meat that had been left in the sun for weeks. "Catherine Ironwood," he said. His voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Cherokee blood. I can smell it on you. I'm not easily spooked. 9 years of solo hiking in remote areas teaches you to handle strange situations. But everything about this felt wrong. The way he knew my name. The way he moved. The smell. "Dr. Steele, I think you need medical attention. Let me help you get back to the vehicles." "The vehicles won't start," he said. "Haven't started for days. She won't let them." "She?" "The bone mother. She's been waiting so long for someone like you. Someone with the old blood." I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on him. My training kicked in. When dealing with someone who might be having a psychological break, stay calm. Don't make sudden movements. Look for ways to de-escalate. "Why don't you tell me about your research?" I said. "Your journal mentioned some interesting finds." "Interesting?" He laughed, and the sound made my skin crawl. "We thought we were studying the dead. We didn't realize the dead were studying us." He pointed toward the excavation site. The bones that had been arranged in spirals were gone. Just empty holes in the muddy ground where they'd been. "Where did they go?" I asked. "Back where they belong, under the earth, waiting for her command." I heard something behind me and spun around. Nothing visible in the fog, but I could swear I'd heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the mud. "Dr. Steele, I'm going to radio for help." I tried my radio again. Still nothing but static. But underneath the white noise, I thought I heard something else. Voices. Whispers in a language I didn't recognize. "No one's coming," Steele said. "No one ever comes to Devil's Backbone unless she calls them." "Who calls them?" Instead of answering, he started walking toward the dig site. His movements were getting worse, more mechanical, like he was fighting his own body for control. I followed him, keeping my distance. At the edge of the excavation, he stopped and pointed down into the hole. "Look," he said, "look what we found." I approached carefully and peered into the excavation. It was deeper than I'd first thought, maybe 8 feet down. The walls were lined with stone, not natural rock, but carved blocks fitted together without mortar. Cherokee construction, but older than anything I'd seen before. At the bottom of the hole was a chamber. Inside the chamber was a burial that made no sense. The skeleton was huge, at least 7 feet tall, maybe 8. But it wasn't just one skeleton. It was made of bones from dozens of different people, all fitted together into a single, massive form. Skulls were stacked to form the head. Ribs from different bodies created an enormous chest cavity. Arms and legs were constructed from multiple sets of bones, making limbs that looked too long and too strong for any human. And around this impossible skeleton, hundreds of smaller bones were arranged in perfect geometric patterns. Finger bones formed spirals. Toe bones created circles. Everything precise, everything deliberate. "Pre-Cherokee," Steele whispered. 2,000 years old, maybe more. But it's not Cherokee work. It's not anyone's work. No culture we know about ever created anything like this. What is it? A guardian, a protector of the dead. The Cherokee called her Bone Mother, but she's older than them, older than any tribe we have records for. I stared down at the bizarre burial. Academic curiosity was fighting with a growing sense of dread. This was the kind of find that could rewrite textbooks, but something about it felt deeply wrong. "Your team just left this here?" I asked. "They tried to take pieces. For study. For carbon dating." Steele's voice got quieter. She didn't like that. "What happened to them?" He turned to look at me, and I saw that his eyes weren't just black, they were empty. Like someone had scooped out everything human and left only dark holes. "They're still here," he said. "They're all still here." That's when I heard the screaming. It came from somewhere in the fog, echoing off the trees and rocks. High-pitched, terrified screaming that went on and on. The kind of scream someone makes when they know they're about to die. Then it stopped, sudden and complete, like someone had flipped a switch. "Doctor Steele," I said slowly, "how long have you been dead?" He smiled that awful brown-toothed smile again. 5 days, same as the others. But she needs us. Needs us to bring her someone with Cherokee blood, someone who can wake her up properly. The ground underneath my feet started to vibrate, a low rumble that I felt in my bones. Around the excavation site, the earth began to crack and shift, and from those cracks, more bones started emerging. I ran. 9 years of hiking, these mountains had taught me where to put my feet, how to navigate the muddy trails without falling. But I'd never run through fog this thick, while being chased by a dead archaeologist and whatever was coming up out of the ground behind me. I could hear Steele following me, but his footsteps sounded wrong, too heavy, like he was carrying extra weight. I didn't look back to see what that might be. The fog seemed to be getting thicker, instead of burning off like it should have as the day warmed up. I could barely see the trail markers. Twice, I almost ran right off the ridge into empty air. Behind me, I heard more sounds. Not just Steele's footsteps, but others. Lots of others. And underneath it all, a grinding noise like stones being rubbed together. I reached for my emergency whistle and blew 3 sharp blasts, the universal signal for help in the mountains. The sound echoed off the cliffs and died in the fog. Something answered back. A whistle that sounded like mine, but wrong, too long, too high-pitched. Like someone who had never heard a whistle before was trying to copy the sound. Then another whistle, from a different direction. And another. I was being surrounded. I veered off the main trail and headed for one of the smaller paths that led down into Crow's Hollow. It was steeper and more dangerous, but if I could get down off the ridge, maybe I could find help. Maybe the radio would work in the valley. As I half ran, half slid down the muddy slope, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Dr. Steele had been dead for 5 days, but he was walking around and talking. The bones from the burial site had rearranged themselves. There was something in that excavation that shouldn't exist. I'm not a superstitious person. I have a PhD in anthropology. I believe in evidence, in rational explanations. But I also grew up hearing my grandmother's stories about the old days, about things in these mountains that white people's science couldn't explain. The Bone Mother. I'd heard that name before, in stories my grandmother told. A Cherokee witch who could command the dead, who punished anyone who disturbed the graves of her people. But those were just stories. Weren't they? I was so busy thinking that I almost ran straight into the tree. It had fallen across the path, a massive oak that must have come down recently. The trunk was too thick to climb over and too long to go around easily. I'd have to backtrack or find another way down. As I stood there catching my breath and trying to decide what to do, I noticed something strange about the tree. The break wasn't clean, like it had fallen in a storm. It looked like it had been twisted apart, the wood splintered and shredded, like something incredibly strong had just reached out and snapped it in half. And carved into the bark, I could see symbols. Not carved recently, the cuts were old, worn smooth by weather. Cherokee writing, but in a dialect I didn't recognize. I was trying to make out the symbols when I heard voices coming down the trail behind me. Multiple voices, but they were all talking in perfect unison, like a creepy chorus. Catherine Ironwood, Cherokee blood. Come back to us. I looked around frantically for another way down. To my left, the slope was too steep, nothing but loose rocks and a 40-foot drop to more rocks. To my right, the hillside was gentler, but it led into thick woods where I could easily get lost. The voices were getting closer. I chose the woods. I crashed through the underbrush, branches catching my uniform and scraping my face. Behind me, I could hear my pursuers doing the same, but they sounded like they were moving faster. like they didn't care about the branches or the thorns. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I stumbled into a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old foundation, just some stacked stones where a cabin had been long ago. Probably a homestead from the 1800s, back when people first started settling in these hollows. I crouched down behind the stone wall and tried to control my breathing. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure they'd be able to hear it. The woods around the clearing went quiet. Not the normal quiet of animals hiding the absolute silence I'd noticed back at the dig site. Like everything alive had simply stopped existing. Then I saw them. They came out of the trees slowly, deliberately. Dr. Steele was in the lead, but he wasn't alone. Behind him walked 3 other people in muddy clothes. A young woman with blonde hair, an older man with a gray beard, and a kid who couldn't have been more than 20. All of them moved with that same mechanical, wrong gait. All of them had the same black, empty eyes. "We found her," the blonde woman said. Her voice was flat, emotionless. "Cherokee blood," said the bearded man. "She can wake the mother," said the kid. They spread out around the clearing, cutting off any escape routes. I was trapped. "Catherine Ironwood." "Doctor," Steele said. "You don't understand what you've stumbled into. This is bigger than a few old graves." "I understand enough," I managed to say. "You're all dead." The young woman laughed. "Dead is such a limited concept. We're more than dead. We're chosen." "Chosen for what?" "To serve, to gather, to prepare the way." The bearded man's voice sounded like gravel. "The Bone Mother has been sleeping for so long. But now, with the old blood here, she can truly wake up." I thought about my grandmother's stories again. The Cherokee believed that some places were sacred not just because of who was buried there, but because of what was buried there. Spirits. Guardians. Things that were never human to begin with. "What is she?" I asked. "Ancient," Steele said. "From before the Cherokee, before any tribe we know about. A protector of the dead, but not just Cherokee dead. All the dead of these mountains. Pioneer dead. Native dead. Settler dead. Civil War dead. Anyone who died here becomes part of her army." As if summoned by his words, more figures began emerging from the trees. People in different clothes, from different time periods. I saw a woman in a pioneer dress, her throat torn open. A man in a Civil War uniform, his chest caved in. A miner with a crushed skull, all of them with those same black, empty eyes. "How many?" I whispered. "Hundreds," the blonde woman said. "Maybe thousands. These mountains have seen a lot of death over the years." They started moving closer. Slowly, like they had all the time in the world. I looked around desperately for any kind of weapon, any way to defend myself. My hand fell on a piece of the old foundation, a chunk of limestone about the size of a softball. "Cherokee blood is special," Steele continued, like he was giving a lecture. "It's connected to this land in ways other blood isn't. When she tastes it, really tastes it, she'll be strong enough to extend her reach. Strong enough to wake up all the dead, not just the ones who died here." "You're talking about raising an army of zombies." The kid shook his head. "Not zombies. Servants. The faithful dead, serving their rightful master." I hefted the limestone chunk. It wasn't much, but it was something. "And what happens to me?" "You join us," the blonde woman said, "after she's done with you." They were close enough now that I could smell them. That awful rotting meat smell that had come from Steele back at the dig site. The smell of bodies that should have been underground days ago. I stood up and threw the rock as hard as I could at Steele's head. It hit him square in the forehead with a sound like a melon dropping. His head snapped back, and for a second I thought I'd hurt him. Then he straightened up and smiled. There was a dent in his forehead where the rock had hit, but no blood, no pain. "That wasn't very polite," he said. "They rushed me all at once. I've never been in a fight with dead people before. It's not like the movies. They don't move slow or moan dramatically. They move like people with nothing left to lose, because that's exactly what they are." The blonde woman reached me first. I grabbed her wrist as she clawed at my face, and her skin felt like cold rubber. I managed to throw her off balance and push her into the stone foundation, but she bounced right back up like the impact didn't hurt at all. The bearded man grabbed my shoulder and spun me around. His grip was impossibly strong, like being held by a machine. I stomped on his foot as hard as I could, which would have crippled a living person. He didn't even flinch. But I noticed something. When the blonde woman hit the stone foundation, she'd slowed down for just a second, like the old stone had some kind of effect on her. I broke free from the bearded man and scrambled up onto the foundation wall. It was only about 3 feet high, but it put me above them and gave me a little breathing room. Cherokee worked this stone, I said, more to myself than to them. Sacred ground. Steele tilted his head. Clever girl, yes, blessed stones slow us down a little. But they won't stop us. And they won't stop her. That's when I heard it. The sound I'd been dreading since I first saw those bone spirals back at the dig site. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps coming through the woods. But these weren't human footsteps. They sounded like someone walking on stilts, or like bones clicking against rocks. The dead people around me went still. Even their breathing stopped, though I guess they probably didn't need to breathe anyway. "She's coming," the kid whispered. "The mother is coming." The footsteps got closer. With each step, I felt the ground vibrate slightly. Whatever was making those sounds was big, heavy, and it was heading straight for our clearing. I jumped down from the stone wall and ran for the tree line, but the dead people didn't try to stop me. They just stood there, waiting, like an honor guard. I made it about 20 feet before she stepped out of the fog. The bone mother was 8 feet, tall and made entirely of human bones. Not like the skeleton I'd seen in the excavation, this was different. Bones from hundreds of different people, all fitted together into something that had never been human. Her skull was formed from a dozen different skulls fused together. Her arms were constructed from dozens of arm bones, making limbs that were too long and had too many joints. Her ribcage was a cathedral of ribs from different bodies, creating a chest cavity that was impossibly deep. She wore a cloak made of human scalps and carried a staff topped with a child's skull. But the worst part was that she was beautiful. Despite being made of bones, despite the horror of what she was, there was something majestic about her. Something that made me understand why people would worship her, would serve her. She looked at me with eye sockets that held points of red light, and when she spoke, her voice was like wind through a graveyard. "Cherokee child," she said in perfect English. "You have come home at last." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I wanted to scream, but my voice was gone. All I could do was stand there and stare up at this impossible thing that had been sleeping under Devil's Backbone for 2,000 years. "Your blood remembers this place," she continued. "Your ancestors knew me, served me, fed me. They never served you," I managed to croak out. "Cherokee don't worship death." She laughed, and the sound was like breaking bones. "Child, I am not death. I am what comes after death. I am the promise that the dead will not be forgotten, will not be abandoned, will not rest unavenged." She gestured around the clearing with one impossible arm. "Your people were driven from these mountains. Their graves were desecrated, their bones scattered, their spirits left to wander. I gathered them. I gave them purpose. I gave them peace. By turning them into an army, by giving them the chance to reclaim what was stolen. I thought about my great-great-grandmother, forced to walk 1,000 miles from her home because white settlers wanted her land. I thought about all the Cherokee who had died along the Trail of Tears, who had been buried in unmarked graves far from their sacred mountains. For just a moment, I understood the Bone Mother's appeal. "Your ancestors' bones are part of me now," she said, stepping closer. "They whisper your name. They want you to join them. What would happen to me? You would become my voice in the world above, my hands to do what needs doing. You would help me wake all the dead of these mountains, and together we would drive out those who don't belong. And if I refuse?" She smiled, showing teeth made from finger bones. "You cannot refuse. The blood calls to blood. The dead call to the living. You will serve, willing or not." She reached out with one bone hand toward my face. That's when I remembered something my grandmother had told me about Cherokee burial practices. About how the dead weren't supposed to linger in the world of the living. About how there were rituals to help spirits move on to the nightland. "I know the old ways," I said quickly. "I know the songs." The Bone Mother paused. "The songs are forgotten. The singers are dead. Not all of them." I started singing. It was a song my grandmother had taught me when I was little, a song for helping the dead find their way home. I'd never really understood the words. They were in old Cherokee dialect, but I'd memorized them anyway. The effect was immediate. The bone mother staggered back like I'd hit her. The red lights in her eye sockets flickered. Around the clearing, the dead people started convulsing. Some of them fell to their knees. "Stop," the bone mother hissed. I kept singing. With each verse, I could feel something changing. The oppressive weight in the air was lifting. The fog was starting to clear. "You don't understand," she said, her voice less commanding now. "Without me, they have no rest. Without me, they wander forever." "Then let them go," I said between verses. "Let them find their own peace." I sang louder, putting everything I had into the old words. My grandmother's voice seemed to join mine, and behind hers, other voices. Older voices. Cherokee voices that remembered when these mountains were free. The bone mother shrieked a sound like 1,000 breaking bones. She began to collapse, the bones that made up her impossible body falling apart and scattering across the clearing. As she fell, the dead people around me started changing too. The black emptiness left their eyes. Color returned to their skin. They looked around confused, like they were waking up from a long nightmare. "Thank you," Dr. Steele whispered, his voice human again. Then he collapsed and didn't get back up. One by one, all of them fell, really dead this time, finally at rest. The last thing I saw of the bone mother was her skull, the fusion of a dozen different skulls rolling across the ground toward me. The red lights in the eye sockets were fading, but just before they went out completely, I heard her voice one last time. "This is not finished, Cherokee child. As long as the dead are dishonored, I will return." Then the lights went out, and she was just bones scattered on the forest floor. I found my way back to the dig site as the sun was setting. The fog had cleared completely, and my radio was working again. I called in the deaths of 4 archaeologists and spent the next 3 days answering questions from state police, federal investigators, and university officials. The official report said that Dr. Steele and his team had been overcome by toxic gases from a natural cave system they'd uncovered during their excavation. Hydrogen sulfide poisoning can cause hallucinations and disorientation before it kills you. Everyone seemed satisfied with that explanation. I didn't mention the bone mother. I didn't mention the army of the dead. I didn't mention anything that couldn't be explained by science and rational thinking. But I did make sure the excavation was properly sealed and consecrated. I brought Samuel Crowfeather, a Cherokee elder from the Eastern Band, to perform the proper ceremonies. We reburied the bones with respect, the way they should have been buried 2,000 years ago. "She'll sleep again?" Samuel told me as we finished the ritual. "But not forever. The dead remember their grievances, and there are always more dead." He was right. Over the next few months, I started hearing reports from other rangers about strange incidents in the mountains. Hikers finding bones arranged in geometric patterns. Campers reporting voices in languages they didn't recognize. Construction crews refusing to work on sites where old graves had been disturbed. I put in for a transfer to Site 47 as the permanent guardian. The Park Service thought I was being overly cautious, but they approved it. Now I hike that ridge every few days, checking on the burial grounds, making sure no one else tries to dig where they shouldn't. Sometimes, on foggy mornings, I think I hear her voice calling from underground, reminding me that she's still there, still waiting. The bone mother sleeps, but she doesn't forget. And sometimes, when I'm doing research on Cherokee burial practices, I find old records that mention her. Different names and different dialects, but always the same story. A guardian of the dead who punishes those who disturb the graves of her people. The Cherokee weren't the first people to live in these mountains. They won't be the last. But as long as the dead are buried here, as long as their bones rest in this sacred ground, something will be watching over them. I've made my peace with that. I've made my peace with her. Because I understand now that some things are more important than the rational, explainable world. Some things are worth believing in, even if you can't prove them with science. The dead deserve respect. The dead deserve protection. And sometimes, the dead deserve to rest. My name is Catherine Ironwood, and I've been guarding Devil's Backbone Ridge for 2 years now. I plan to keep guarding it for as long as these old bones will carry me, because somewhere deep underground, the bone mother is listening. And she's waiting for someone to forget the lessons of the past. I won't let that happen. Not on my watch. Not ever again. My name is Margaret Thornfield, and I've spent 11 years protecting the cultural heritage of Jefferson National Forest in Virginia. Most people think that means I pick up trash and post warning signs, but my real job is something much more important. I document the old stories and songs before they disappear forever. I have a PhD in folklore, which sounds fancy but really just means I know a lot about the tales people tell when the lights go out. The mountains of Virginia hold centuries of music passed down from parent to child, and every year, another singer dies, taking their songs with them. That's why I'm here, racing against time with my recording equipment, trying to capture these vanishing voices. August 1978 was brutal. The worst drought anyone could remember had turned the forest into a tinderbox. Creek beds that usually sang with water lay cracked and empty. The air hung thick and still, like the whole mountain was holding its breath. Even the birds seemed quieter than usual. I was working in a place called Midnight Hollow, about 30 miles from the nearest settlement. It's a natural bowl carved into the mountainside, surrounded by limestone caves that create perfect acoustics. The Cherokee used to gather there for ceremonies, and later, during the Civil War, it became the site of something much darker. But in 1978, it was just another location on my research map. The old-timers had warned me about the hollow. Not in any dramatic way. Mountain people don't waste words on drama. They'd just mention that it was a singing place and leave it at that. I figured they meant the acoustics were good, which made sense. Sound carried strangely in that bowl-shaped depression, bouncing off the cave mouths and rock walls in ways that made even a whisper seem to come from everywhere at once. My contact in the area was Widow Parsons, 89 years old, and one of the last people who knew the complete cycles of the old ballads. The ballads of the 80s, traditional songs could go on for 20 or 30 verses, telling entire stories of love and loss, murder and revenge. Mrs. Parsons had learned them from her grandmother, who learned them from hers, creating an unbroken chain stretching back to the earliest days of settlement. "You be careful up in that hollow, child," she told me the first time we met. She was sitting on her porch, snapping green beans into a metal bowl. "Some songs ain't meant for recording." I smiled and nodded, the way you do when elderly people share their superstitions. I was a scientist, after all. I dealt in facts and documentation, not ghost stories. But even then, something felt wrong about the place. The silence was too complete. In 11 years of forest work, I'd never been anywhere so quiet. No insects buzzing, no birds calling, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the oppressive weight of the heat and an odd quality to the air that made sounds seem muffled and strange. I set up my base camp at the edge of the hollow, close enough to study the acoustics but far enough back to catch any breeze that might struggle through the trees. My equipment was professional grade, the best recording gear the Forest Service budget could manage. I documented hundreds of traditional songs with it, creating an archive that would preserve these voices long after their owners were gone. That first evening, as the sun disappeared behind the ridge, I heard it for the first time. Singing, clear and beautiful, drifting up from the bottom of the hollow, a woman's voice, performing what sounded like an old ballad about lost love and tragedy. The melody was hauntingly familiar, like something I'd heard in childhood but couldn't quite place. I grabbed my recorder and headed down the slope, following the sound. But as I got closer to where the voice seemed to be coming from, it faded away. By the time I reached the bottom of the hollow, there was nothing but silence again. Strange, but not impossible. Sound traveled in funny ways in places like this. The singer could have been anywhere in the surrounding forest, and the hollow's acoustics might have made her seem much closer than she really was. Still, as I walked back to my camp in the gathering darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the cave mouths that dotted the hollow's walls. Just tricks of shadow and starlight, I told myself. The heat was getting to me, making me imagine things. But that night, lying in my tent with the oppressive humidity pressing down like a blanket, I heard the singing again. Multiple voices this time, weaving together in harmonies that made my skin crawl with their beauty. And in the morning, when I checked my equipment, I discovered something that made no sense at all. My recording gear had been running all night, capturing everything. But when I played back the tape, there was nothing there but silence. The next day brought no relief from the heat. I woke up drenched in sweat despite the early hour, and even the trees seemed to droop with exhaustion. The silence in the hollow felt even heavier than before, like the whole place was waiting for something to happen. I spent the morning checking my equipment, running diagnostics to figure out why it hadn't captured the singing from the night before. Everything tested perfectly. The microphones were sensitive enough to pick up a whispered conversation from 50 yards away, and the recording levels showed they'd been active all night. Yet somehow, those beautiful, haunting voices hadn't registered at all. Around noon, I hiked out to visit Mrs. Parsons again. Her little cabin sat in a clearing about 5 miles from the hollow, connected to the outside world by a dirt road that was barely more than 2 tire ruts through the trees. She was on her porch again, this time shelling peas, her gnarled fingers working with the automatic precision of decades of practice. "You look tired, child," she said without looking up. "That hollow keeping you awake?" I told her about the singing, describing the voices and the melodies as best I could. Her hands went still, and for the first time since I'd met her, Mrs. Parsons looked genuinely worried. "What kind of songs were they singing?" she asked. I hummed a few bars of what I remembered. Mrs. Parsons' face went pale. "That's the murdered girl's lament," she whispered. "My grandmother used to sing it, but she made me promise never to teach it to anyone else. Said it was a true song, about something that really happened." "What really happened, Mrs.?" Parsons set down her bowl of peas and looked toward the hollow, though the trees blocked any view of it from her porch. "During the war, Union soldiers came through these mountains hunting Confederate sympathizers. They rounded up everyone they could find in that hollow, men, women, children, and shot them all. Said they were harboring rebels. I felt a chill despite the heat. How many people died? Nobody knows for sure. Dozens, maybe more. They threw the bodies in the caves and sealed them up. The families that survived were too scared to go back and retrieve them." She picked up her peas again, but her hands were shaking now. "My grandmother said you could hear them singing for years afterward, calling for justice, calling for someone to tell their story. But that was over a century ago," I said, trying to inject some rationality into the conversation. "Even if there were voices, they would have stopped long before now." "Mrs. Parsons gave me a look that mixed pity with genuine fear. "Some wrongs are too big to just fade away, child, and some songs are too important to let die." I thanked her for the information and hiked back to my camp, my mind racing. I was a scientist, trained to look for logical explanations. Mass graves, historical trauma, the power of suggestion combined with isolation and heat. All of these could create the psychological conditions for auditory hallucinations. The fact that my equipment hadn't recorded anything only supported that theory. But as the sun set and darkness crept into the hollow, I found myself setting up my gear with extra care. If there were voices, I was going to capture them. And if there weren't, at least I'd have proof that my mind was playing tricks on me. The singing started just after midnight. This time, I was ready. I sat perfectly still in my camp chair, recording equipment running, headphones on to monitor the input levels. The voices rose from the bottom of the hollow like smoke, beautiful and terrible at the same time. A woman's voice led the others, singing in a clear soprano about betrayal and murder. Other voices joined in, creating harmonies that seemed to wrap around my heart and squeeze. I watched the needle on my sound meter. It wasn't moving. According to my equipment, the night was perfectly silent, but I could hear them. God help me, I could hear every word. The lead singer was telling the story of the massacre, verse after verse of pain and terror set to a melody that made me want to weep. She sang about children crying for their mothers, about men dying with prayers on their lips, about women who tried to shield their babies with their own bodies. And as she sang, other voices joined in. Men's voices, children's voices, all of them adding their own verses to the terrible ballad. I took off my headphones and crept closer to the edge of the hollow. The singing was definitely coming from down there, echoing off the cave mouths and rock walls. In the starlight, I thought I could see shapes moving at the bottom of the depression, pale figures that seemed to glow with their own light. My rational mind screamed at me to stay back, to trust my equipment over my senses. But the songs were so beautiful, so heartbreakingly sad, that I found myself walking down the slope without conscious decision. Each step brought the voices into sharper focus, until I could make out individual words, individual stories of suffering and injustice. 20 feet from the bottom, I stopped. The singers were there. I could see them clearly now. Dozens of translucent figures in clothing from another era, standing in a rough circle around the largest cave mouth. Men in work clothes and Confederate gray, women in long dresses, children in simple cotton garments. All of them singing, all of them looking directly at me. The woman leading the chorus stepped forward. Her dress was stained with what looked like blood, and half her face was missing, blown away by a musket ball. But her voice was perfect, clear and strong as she sang her story of love and loss, of a life cut short by violence and hate. I stumbled backward, my scientific training finally overriding the hypnotic pull of the music. This was impossible. Hallucinations didn't work this way. They didn't create new information. Complete stories I'd never heard before. And the detail was too perfect, too consistent. These weren't fragments of my imagination running wild in the heat and isolation. These were real. I ran back to my camp, the singing following me up the slope like a tide of sorrow. I grabbed my radio and tried to call for help, but got nothing but static. My cell phone showed no signal. Even my satellite communicator, which should have worked anywhere on Earth, couldn't find a connection. I was alone in the hollow with the dead, and they wanted something from me. The singing continued until dawn, growing louder and more complex with each passing hour. By the time the sun finally rose, I counted at least 50 different voices, all of them telling pieces of the same horrible story. And worst of all, I was beginning to recognize some of the melodies. They were variations on songs I'd recorded elsewhere, traditional ballads that had been passed down through generations of mountain families. These weren't just the voices of the dead, they were the source of the songs themselves, the original victims whose stories had become the foundation of Appalachian musical tradition. And for some reason, they had chosen me to hear their complete tale. I didn't sleep for the next 3 days. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the singing, calling me back down into the hollow. During the daylight hours, I tried to maintain some semblance of scientific method, documenting everything I saw and heard, taking photographs and making detailed notes. But the evidence was maddeningly inconsistent. My cameras captured nothing but empty landscape. My sound equipment registered silence. Even the electromagnetic field detectors I'd brought to test the caves showed no unusual readings. According to every instrument I had, Midnight Hollow was exactly what it appeared to be. An empty depression in the forest with some interesting acoustic properties. But I knew what I was seeing and hearing. The spirits were getting stronger each night, their songs more complex and detailed. What had started as a simple ballad was evolving into an epic cycle. Dozens of verses that told the complete story of the massacre and its aftermath. Each victim had their own song, their own tale of injustice that wove into the larger narrative like threads in a tapestry. On the third night, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The chorus was growing. New voices were joining the singing, voices that didn't match the period clothing of the original victims. A man in a 1,940 seconds work shirt. A woman in a 1,960 seconds hiking outfit. A young man in clothes that looked like they could have been purchased last year. These weren't Civil War victims. These were more recent deaths, people who had somehow been drawn into the hollow and never left. I hiked out to Mrs. Parsons' cabin the next morning, desperate for answers. I found her, sitting on her porch as usual, but she looked like she'd aged 10 years overnight. Her face was drawn and pale, and her hands shook as she poured me a cup of coffee from an old metal pot. "You heard them singing last night," she said. It wasn't a question. "Mrs. Parsons, I think people are dying in that hollow, recent people. I know what you saw." She set down her coffee cup with trembling fingers. "It's getting worse, isn't it? More voices every night?" I nodded, afraid to trust my voice. "My grandmother told me this would happen someday," Mrs. Parsons said. "The spirits have been waiting all these years for someone who could hear the complete song, someone who could tell their story properly. But every time someone gets close, they..." She trailed off, staring into her coffee. "They what?" "They add them to the chorus." The words hit me like a physical blow. "You're saying they're killing people? The spirits themselves?" "Not killing, exactly. Calling. The songs are so beautiful, so sad, that people can't resist following them deeper into the caves. And once you're down there in the dark, listening to all that pain and sorrow..." She shook her head. "You don't want to leave." You want to add your voice to theirs, to help tell the story. I thought about the pull I'd felt, the hypnotic quality of the singing that had drawn me down the slope despite my fear. How many people have gone missing around here? Over the years? Dozens. Hikers mostly, and a few researchers like yourself. The Forest Service always blames it on getting lost or falling into ravines. But the locals know better. Why didn't you warn me? Mrs. Parsons met my eyes, and I saw decades of guilt and fear in her weathered face. Because someone has to hear the complete song eventually, someone has to set them free. My grandmother thought it might be her, but she wasn't strong enough. I thought it might be me, but I was too scared. When you came, along with your fancy equipment and your degrees, she shrugged helplessly. I thought maybe you'd be the one. The one to what? To finish it. To sing the song all the way to the end so they can finally rest. I left Mrs. Parsons' cabin with my mind reeling. Everything she'd told me went against my scientific training, but it also explained what I'd been experiencing. The spirits weren't just singing random ballads. They were performing an epic cycle that had never been completed, a musical monument to injustice that demanded resolution. But the cost of that resolution might be my life. That evening, I sat in my camp and watched the sun set over the hollow with a mixture of dread and determination. I'd come here to preserve dying traditions, to capture the last echoes of a vanishing culture. I'd never imagined that the culture itself might capture me. The singing started earlier that night, just as the last light faded from the sky. This time, I didn't resist the pull. I packed my recording equipment. Even though it couldn't capture what I was hearing, I still felt compelled to try, and walked down into the hollow like a woman going to her execution. The spirits were waiting for me, not just the original massacre victims now, but all the others who had been drawn in over the decades. They stood in expanding circles around the cave mouths, their translucent forms glowing with pale light. At the center of it all was the woman who had led that first night's singing, her ruined face somehow beautiful in the starlight. She stepped forward as I approached, her voice rising in welcome. The song she sang was about recognition, about finally finding someone who could hear and understand their tale. Other voices joined hers, creating harmonies that made my bones ache with their beauty. I found myself walking closer, drawn by the music like a moth to flame. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, but the songs were so perfect, so heartbreakingly lovely, that resistance seemed not just futile but wrong. These voices had been waiting for over a century to tell their complete story. Who was I to deny them that chance? I was 10 feet from the largest cave mouth when I heard a new voice join the chorus. A familiar voice, singing in a warbling soprano that I'd recorded dozens of times over the past few years. Mrs. Parsons was there among the spirits, her weathered face peaceful for the first time since I'd known her. She caught my eye and nodded, then opened her mouth to add her voice to the eternal song. In that moment, I understood. This had always been her plan. She'd brought me here not to save the spirits, but to give them what they needed. A witness, a documenter, someone who could finally complete their interrupted story. And now she'd joined them herself, adding the final piece they needed to achieve their purpose. The song they sang together was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't just music. It was history made audible, justice given voice, truth transformed into art. Every note contained layers of meaning. Every harmony revealed new depths of sorrow and beauty. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was about to become part of it forever. The music surrounded me like water, pulling me deeper into the circle of singers. Each step brought new voices into focus. A child singing about the doll she'd never find, a young man lamenting the sweetheart he'd never marry, an old man weaving verses about grandsons he'd never meet. Their individual stories braided together into something larger than the sum of its parts, a musical tapestry that captured not just their deaths, but the entire scope of what had been lost. I was 3 feet from the cave mouth when Mrs. Parsons broke from the chorus and stepped toward me. Her spirit form looked younger somehow, as if joining the eternal song had restored something that life had worn away. "Child," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the otherworldly music surrounding us. "You don't have to stay. That was never the requirement." "I don't understand." The words came out as a whisper, barely audible over the singing. "The song needs to be completed, but not by joining us. It needs to be heard. Really heard." understood and remembered by someone who can carry it back to the world. The lead singer, the woman with half her face blown away, turned toward us. When she spoke, her voice somehow projected over the entire chorus without breaking the musical spell. "We have been trapped here by silence," she said. "Our stories were never told, our deaths never acknowledged, our names never spoken with the reverence due to the murdered dead. The songs that grew from our suffering were beautiful, but they were incomplete, fragments passed down by those who knew only pieces of the truth." She gestured to the caves behind her. "We have waited generations for someone who could hear the complete cycle, someone who could understand what really happened here and carry that knowledge forward. The others who came before you." She looked sadly at the more recent spirits. They were overcome by the beauty of the music itself. They chose to stay and sing rather than return to tell the tale. I felt the pull of the song intensifying, my feet moving without conscious command toward the glowing cave mouth. "How do I know I won't make the same choice?" Mrs. Parsons smiled. "Because you're not just a listener, child. You're a storyteller. And every storyteller knows that the most important part isn't the telling, it's making sure someone else hears." The chorus began to shift, the individual voices weaving together into something that felt like a climax. I realized this was it, the moment when their epic song reached its conclusion. The choice I made in the next few minutes would determine whether their stories lived or died with me. I closed my eyes and listened with every fiber of my being, memorizing each melody, each harmony, each verse that told of injustice and loss. The music filled me completely, threatening to drown my own thoughts in its terrible beauty. Part of me wanted nothing more than to open my mouth and add my voice to theirs, to become part of this eternal monument to suffering. But Mrs. Parsons was right. I was a storyteller, and storytellers had responsibilities that went beyond personal desire. When the song reached its final crescendo, I did something that felt like the hardest thing I'd ever done. Instead of singing, I stepped backward, away from the caves, away from the circle of spirits, away from the most beautiful music I'd ever heard. The effect was immediate. The spirits began to fade, their forms becoming more translucent with each note. But they weren't disappearing in anger or disappointment. They looked peaceful, satisfied, like people finally allowed to rest after carrying an unbearable burden. The lead singer was the last to fade. As her form grew dim, she looked directly at me and smiled with the half of her face that remained intact. "Thank you," she whispered. "Remember us." And then they were gone, all of them. The hollow fell silent for the first time in over a century, and I was alone with the knowledge of what I'd witnessed. I stumbled back to my camp in a daze, my mind reeling with the implications of what had happened. I'd been chosen to witness something impossible, to carry forward a story that had been waiting generations to be told. But how could I possibly explain it to anyone? Who would believe that I'd spoken with the spirits of massacre victims and heard their complete tale? The answer came to me as I packed my equipment in the pre-dawn darkness. I couldn't tell the literal truth. No one would accept it. But I could do what folklorists had always done. I could preserve the songs themselves, presenting them as traditional ballads collected from mountain singers who'd learned them from their grandparents. Mrs. Parsons had been right about one thing. Someone had needed to hear the complete cycle. But more than that, someone had needed to survive the hearing and carry those voices back to the world. As I hiked out of Midnight Hollow for the last time, I was already composing the introduction to my collection. The Midnight Hollow Ballads, a complete cycle of traditional Appalachian songs, commemorating the Civil War massacre at Jefferson National Forest, Virginia. I would present them as the last fragments of a dying oral tradition, songs passed down through generations of mountain families. Scholars would debate their historical accuracy and literary merit. Musicians would perform them at folk festivals and in concert halls. The stories would live on, preserved in academic archives and carried forward by new voices. And somewhere in the performance of those songs, in their preservation and transmission, the spirits of the massacre victims would find the justice they'd sought for so long. Not the punishment of their killers. That was beyond mortal reach. But something almost as important, the assurance that their suffering had not been forgotten, that their names and stories would outlive the silence that had buried them. I published The Midnight Hollow Ballads 6 months later through the University of Virginia Press. The collection contained 37 complete songs that I claimed to have recorded from various elderly singers throughout Appalachian, Virginia, with Mrs. Parsons credited as the primary source. The academic reception was enthusiastic. Scholars praised the completeness of the cycle and the historical detail embedded in the verses. What they couldn't know was that every word was exactly as I'd heard it that night in the hollow, transcribed from a memory that seemed burned into my mind with supernatural clarity. I could recall not just the melodies and lyrics, but the precise harmonies each spirit had contributed, the way their voices had woven together to create something larger than individual songs. The collection won several awards and became a standard reference for Civil War-era Appalachian music. Folk musicians began performing the ballads at festivals across the country. Graduate students wrote dissertations, analyzing the historical accuracy of the massacre details embedded in the songs. A few researchers even attempted to verify the events described in the ballads, but the historical record was too incomplete to provide confirmation. I never returned to Midnight Hollow. My work took me to other parts of the forest, other collections of traditional music that needed preserving. But I kept track of the hollow through official reports and casual conversations with other rangers. According to all accounts, it had become completely ordinary, just another geographical feature with no unusual properties or unexplained incidents. No more hikers went missing. No more reports of mysterious singing echoed through the ranger stations. The hollow had become what it appeared to be: an empty depression in the forest with some interesting acoustic properties and a few limestone caves. But I knew the truth. The spirits had found their peace through the preservation of their stories. Their songs lived on in the world of the living, performed and studied and passed down to new generations. That was all they had ever wanted, not vengeance, but remembrance. Sometimes, late at night when I'm working on my current projects, I'll play recordings of performers singing the Midnight Hollow ballads. The musicians are talented, the arrangements beautiful, but something is always missing, that otherworldly quality that marked the original performances, the sense that these weren't just songs but testimonials from beyond the grave, which is as it should be, I suppose. The spirits have moved on, to whatever comes after justice. The songs belong to the living now, to carry forward and interpret as we see fit. The cycle is complete, the story told, the debt of silence finally paid. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between one recording and the next, I swear I can hear an echo of those original voices. Not calling me back, they have no more need of me. Just reminding me that some stories are too important to let die, and that the dead trust the living to keep their memories alive. Mrs. Parsons had been right about one thing from the very beginning. Music has power in these mountains. The power to preserve truth, to demand justice, to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. And sometimes, if you're very lucky or very unlucky, that power will choose you to be its instrument. I've spent the 30 years since Midnight Hollow collecting traditional songs throughout Appalachian, Virginia, building an archive that will outlast me and everyone I've known. It's important work, necessary work, but none of it has been quite like that night when I stood between two worlds and chose to serve as a messenger rather than join the eternal chorus. The dead have their own music now, whatever lies beyond the veil. The living have the songs I brought back, preserved in recordings and sheet music and scholarly articles that will keep those voices alive for generations to come. And somewhere in the balance between those two realms, justice has finally been served. My name is David Stonecrow, and I've been a park ranger at Daniel Boone National Forest for 13 years. That's long enough to see every kind of trouble these Kentucky mountains can throw at you. Rock slides, flash floods, lost hikers, bear encounters, I've handled them all. But what happened at Raven's Roost in September of 1987 changed everything I thought I knew about these hills. People always ask about my last name. Stonecrow comes from my Cherokee grandmother's side. Beloved Stone Raven, she used to tell me, though I never felt much connection to that old blood until recently. My Scottish father raised me practical and skeptical. David, he'd say, there's a logical explanation for everything if you look hard enough. I believed that. Had to, in my line of work. Raven's Roost is an 800-foot limestone cliff that draws rock climbers from all over the country. It's my specialty area. I've logged over 50 technical rescues on that wall. The cliff face is tricky, full of hidden ledges and loose rock. Underground rivers carved out caves and passages that honeycomb the whole structure. Most climbers stick to the marked routes, but some always try to pioneer new paths. That's usually when I get called in. 3 years ago, my best friend Tommy died on that cliff. We'd been climbing partners since college, and he knew those rocks better than anyone. The accident report said equipment failure. His anchor gave way during a storm. I was the one who found his body at the bottom of the ravine. I still blame myself for not being there with him that day. The Cherokee have stories about Raven's Roost going back centuries. They say it's a sacred place where the thunderbirds nest. My grandmother used to tell me those tales when I was little, but I always figured they were just old explanations for weather patterns. Before modern meteorology, people needed some way to make sense of the violent storms that seemed to center on that particular cliff. September 1987 was migration season, and the weather had been strange all month. Thunderstorms kept rolling through, more frequent and intense than usual. The lightning strikes around Raven's Roost were especially bad. We'd had 3 separate incidents of climbers getting caught in electrical activity. That's why I was doing my usual pre-storm safety sweep on September 15th. The National Weather Service had issued severe thunderstorm warnings, and I wanted to make sure no climbers were still on the wall. The radio crackled with updates about 70 mph winds and possible tornadoes, not the kind of weather you want to be hanging from a rope in. I started my patrol around 2 p.m., hiking the base trail that circles the cliff. The woods felt wrong that day, too quiet. During migration season, the forest should be alive, with birds heading south. Instead, I found empty trees and an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. My first stop was Devil's Backbone, the most popular climbing route. I always checked there first because weekend warriors love to attempt it without proper experience. The trail was muddy from recent rains, and storm clouds were already building on the horizon. That's when I found the gear. A full climbing setup, ropes, harnesses, helmets, carabiners scattered across the rocks, about halfway up the route. Not dropped or fallen. Scattered, like someone had been climbing and just vanished mid-route. The ropes were cut clean through, not frayed from wear or damage. Professional cuts, made with a sharp blade. I called out, hoping to hear a response from above. "Hello, anyone up there? This is Park Ranger Stonecrow." Nothing but wind through the limestone. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees in the past hour, and the air tasted of metal and electricity. The hair on my arms stood up, the way it does right before lightning strikes. I radioed base camp. "This is Stonecrow at Devil's Backbone. Found abandoned climbing gear, appears to be recent. Beginning search for possible stranded climbers." Static answered me. The radio worked fine that morning, but now it was nothing but white noise and interference. I tried adjusting the frequency, but something was jamming the signal. Probably the incoming storm. Looking up at the cliff face, I could see more gear scattered on ledges higher up. At least 4 climbers' worth of equipment. Either they'd made it to the top and hiked out another way, which was impossible without ropes, or something had happened to them on the wall. The smart thing would have been to wait for backup and better weather. But if people were stranded up there, they didn't have time for smart. The storm was coming fast, and those limestone cliffs became death traps in lightning weather. I started climbing. The first 100 feet went smooth. I know every handhold on Devil's Backbone could climb it blindfolded. But as I gained height, things started feeling off. The wind patterns weren't right. Instead of the steady updrafts you'd expect along a cliff face, the air moved in circles, like something was stirring it from above. At the 200-foot mark, I found the first helmet. It was wedged in a crack, the chin strap torn but not cut. No sign of the climber who'd been wearing it. I clipped it to my gear and kept climbing, scanning every ledge and crevice for signs of life. The radio crackled occasionally, but I couldn't make out any words through the static. The interference was getting worse as I climbed higher. Lightning flickered in the clouds, but the thunder came too soon and too loud, like it was echoing off something massive just out of sight. At 300 feet, I reached the Owl's Nest, a wide ledge that most climbers use as a rest stop. That's where I found the blood. Dark stains splattered across the limestone, already dried but recent. Definitely human blood. I'd seen enough climbing accidents to know. But there was too much of it. Way too much for someone to lose and still walk away. Carved into the rock face above the blood were marks I'd never seen before. Deep gouges in the limestone, arranged in sets of 4. They looked almost like talon marks, but no bird in Kentucky was big enough to leave scratches that size. Each mark was over 6 inches long and cut into solid rock. I touched one of the gouges with my finger. The limestone was still warm. That's when I heard the sound. It started low, like wind through a canyon, but it had rhythm to it. Almost like breathing, but too big and too slow for any animal I knew. The sound came from above, somewhere in the clouds that were building around the cliff's peak. I looked up and saw shapes moving in the storm. Dark forms that seemed too large and too coordinated to be just clouds. For a second, I thought I saw wings, massive wings that blotted out whole sections of sky. Then lightning flashed, and everything looked normal again. Just regular storm clouds doing what storm clouds do. "Get it together, Stonecrow," I muttered. "Altitude and stress, that's all." But my hands were shaking as I resumed climbing. The temperature kept dropping, and the metallic taste in the air was getting stronger. Every piece of metal gear on my rack hummed with static electricity. My carabiners sparked when they touched the rock. At 400 feet, I found the second climber's remains. It wasn't a body, it was pieces, scattered across a narrow ledge, like something had torn the person apart and left the parts to dry. Bones picked clean, gear shredded beyond recognition. The skull was cracked open like an egg. I've seen bear attacks, mountain lion kills, even victims of rock falls. This was different. The bones were scored with the same talon marks I'd found on the ledge below. And they were arranged in a pattern, not random scattering, but deliberate placement. Like a warning. Or an offering. I should have rappelled down right then, should have called for backup and heavy rescue equipment. But something kept me climbing. Maybe it was the blood on that ledge, the thought that someone might still be alive up there. Maybe it was Tommy's voice in my head, the way he used to push me to finish every route we started. Or maybe something was calling me up. The breathing sound got louder as I climbed. It echoed off the limestone walls, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The storm clouds were circling the cliff now, moving against the prevailing wind patterns. Lightning flickered constantly, but it wasn't random. The bolts seemed to trace specific paths around the rock face. At 500 feet, I reached the Raven's Perch, another rest ledge. This one was bigger, with a shallow cave cut back into the cliff. Cherokee pictographs covered the walls, ancient drawings of birds and storms, and human figures with their arms raised to the sky. In the center of the cave was a pile of fresh offerings. Not tourist trash or climbing gear. These were traditional Cherokee items: corn, tobacco, feathers, small carved stones. Someone had been here recently. Someone who knew the old ways. Beside the offerings was a note, written on Park Service stationery in shaky handwriting. "The Thunderbirds are awake. They protect the sacred places. Turn back while you can. J. Flying Hawk." Joseph Flying Hawk was a Cherokee elder from the nearby reservation. He sometimes served as a cultural consultant for the Park Service, helping us understand the traditional significance of certain sites. But he'd never left notes like this before. I pocketed the note and kept climbing. Above me, the cliff face disappeared into the storm clouds. The breathing sound was constant now, and I could feel vibrations in the rock like something huge was moving around up there. At 600 feet, something dove at my head. I ducked and pressed against the wall as a massive shape swept past me. For just a second, I got a clear look. At it, wings span at least 20 feet across, talons the size of climbing axes, eyes like black fire. It moved too fast and too smoothly to be any natural bird. The thing circled back and hovered in front of me, its wing beats creating downdrafts that nearly tore me off the wall. This close, I could see it clearly. It looked like a raven, but bigger than any bird had a right to be. Its feathers were black as midnight, and lightning flickered between them like trapped electricity. It stared at me for what felt like hours. Those black eyes seemed to look right through me, weighing something I couldn't understand. Then it opened its beak and made that breathing sound I'd been hearing, but louder now, deafening. I fumbled for my radio, tried to call for help, but the static was overwhelming. The creature's presence was jamming everything electronic. Even my watch had stopped working. The giant raven tilted its head, studying me. Then it spoke, not in English, but in a language I somehow understood. Words my Cherokee grandmother had whispered to me in dreams. Words that meant sacred ground and trespasser, and punishment. It told me the climbers had been taken for violating the nesting grounds. It told me I would be next if I continued climbing. And it told me my friend Tommy had died for the same reason. He'd found something on this cliff that he wasn't supposed to see. Then it spread its wings and disappeared back into the storm clouds. I hung there on the rock face, 600 feet above the ground, and finally understood what I was dealing with. This wasn't some natural phenomenon or freak weather pattern. The Cherokee stories were real. The Thunderbirds existed, and I was climbing straight into their territory. The smart thing would have been to rappel down immediately. But Tommy's gear was still up there somewhere, and I needed to know what he'd found, what had gotten him killed. So I kept climbing toward the storm. The last 200 feet to the top of Raven's Roost should have taken me 20 minutes. Instead, it took over an hour. Every few moves, the wind would shift and try to tear me off the wall. Lightning struck the cliff face around me, always close enough to feel the heat but never quite hitting me directly. They were playing with me. At 700 feet, I reached a hidden ledge I'd never seen before. It was tucked back behind an overhang, invisible from below. Ancient Cherokee climbing anchors were still embedded in the rock leather and sinew ropes that should have rotted away centuries ago but looked fresh as yesterday. More pictographs covered the walls. These were different from the ones below, more detailed, more urgent. They showed human figures climbing the cliff while giant birds watched from above. Some of the humans made it to the top and were shown making offerings. Others were shown being carried away in massive talons. The final pictograph showed a figure that looked disturbingly like me, same build, same Cherokee features. He was standing at the top of the cliff with his arms raised, but giant bird shadows covered him completely. I tried not to think about what that might mean. The breathing sounds were coming from multiple directions now. More than one thunderbird was circling in the storm clouds. I caught glimpses of them through breaks in the mist, huge forms with wingspans that defied physics. They moved like a coordinated pack, communicating with calls that sounded like controlled thunder. At 750 feet, I found what was left of the climbing team. There was a cave here, bigger than the others, carved deep into the limestone. It smelled of death and electricity. The walls were lined with bones, not just recent ones, but old ones that had been here for decades, maybe longer. In the center of the cave was a nest, a massive construction of branches and metal, woven together with climbing ropes and human hair. It was 20 feet across and 5 feet deep, lined with the softest materials the Thunderbirds could find, expensive climbing gear, down jackets, sleeping bags, and bodies. 3 of the missing climbers were in the nest, positioned like they were sleeping. Their faces were peaceful, but their bodies had been torn apart by massive talons. The 4th climber was still alive. Barely. She looked up at me with eyes that had seen too much. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. "They're protecting something that can't be disturbed." I knelt beside her, checking for injuries I could treat. She was hurt, bad internal bleeding, broken ribs, probably punctured lungs. But she was conscious and talking. "What did you find up here?" I asked. "What made them attack?" She pointed deeper into the cave with a shaking hand. "Eggs," she said. "We found eggs." In the back of the cave, hidden behind the nest, were 3 objects that defied explanation. They looked like eggs, but they were made of some kind of crystalline material that pulsed with internal light. Each one was about 3 feet tall and hummed with electrical energy. Lightning flickered across their surfaces in constant patterns. "We just wanted to take pictures," the woman said. "Document the find." But as soon as we got close, they came. The storm came with them. That's when I heard Tommy's voice. "David." I spun around, and there he was. My dead friend, standing at the mouth of the cave like he'd just walked up from a climb. He looked exactly like he had 3 years ago, same climbing gear, same easy smile, same way of saying my name like we shared a secret. "You shouldn't be here, buddy," Tommy said. "This place isn't for people like us." I knew it wasn't really him. Had to be shock, altitude, the stress of everything I'd seen. But he looked so real, so solid. "What happened to you?" I asked. "I found this place," he said. "Found the eggs. Thought I could take one, study it, prove that. The old stories were real." But they knew. They always know when someone gets too close to their young. The dying climber grabbed my arm. "Don't listen to it," she said. "It's not your friend. They use the dead to confuse the living. But Tommy kept talking. I tried to fight them, David, used every technique we ever learned. But you can't fight the storm itself. You can't climb faster than lightning. The Thunderbird's calls were getting closer now. Multiple voices in the thunder, communicating in that ancient language I somehow understood. They were arguing about what to do with me. Some wanted to kill me immediately. Others wanted to see what I'd do, whether I'd show proper respect or make the same mistake as the others. There's still time, Tommy said. Still time to make it right. But you have to choose respect the sacred laws or die defending the wrong thing. Lightning struck the cave mouth, close enough to blind me temporarily. When my vision cleared, Tommy was gone. The dying climber was still there, but weaker now. My gear bag, she whispered. Emergency beacon, maybe. I found her pack and activated the emergency locator beacon. It should have sent a signal to Park Service headquarters, but the LED just blinked weakly and died. The electromagnetic field around the Thunderbird eggs was jamming everything electronic. That's when the real attack began. The first Thunderbird landed on the ledge outside the cave. Up close, it was even more massive than I'd thought. Its talons scraped grooves in solid limestone as it walked. Lightning crackled between its feathers, and its eyes glowed with their own inner fire. Behind it came two more. They filled the cave mouth, blocking my only escape route. The dying climber couldn't be moved, and I couldn't fight my way past three creatures that controlled the weather itself. The largest Thunderbird stepped forward and fixed me with that burning stare. When it spoke in the old language, I understood every word. You climbed our sacred cliff without permission. You disturbed our nesting grounds. You looked upon our children with unworthy eyes. For these crimes, you will join the others in feeding our young. I thought about the Cherokee protocols Joseph Flying Hawk had taught me during cultural sensitivity training. There were proper ways to approach sacred sites, traditional offerings, and rituals that showed respect. I'm Cherokee, I said in English, then tried to remember the Cherokee words my grandmother had taught me. I am David Stonecrow, grandson of Marie Stonecrow. I came here looking for lost people, not to harm your children. The Thunderbird tilted its head, considering. It spoke to the others in rapid bursts of the old language. They seemed to be debating my fate. I offer my life in exchange for safe passage for this woman, I said, pointing to the dying climber. Take me, but let her reach the ground alive. The debate continued for several minutes while lightning illuminated the cave in strobing flashes. Finally, the largest Thunderbird reached a decision. Your blood carries the old knowledge, it said. Your grandmother sang our songs and left proper offerings. For her sake, we offer you a choice. Prove your respect for the sacred laws or die with the others. What do you want me to do? The Thunderbird gestured toward the eggs with one massive wing. Your friend took knowledge that was not his to have. Photos of our children, evidence of our existence. Find what he hid, destroy it completely, and accept the responsibility of keeping our secret. Do this, and you may live to guard our sacred places. I thought about Tommy's camera gear, his obsession with documenting every climb. If he'd found this place 3 years ago, he would have photographed everything. The question was where he'd hidden the evidence. I'll do it, I said. But I need to get down the cliff to search for his photos. The largest Thunderbird stepped aside. We will watch, it said. If you try to leave without completing the task, you will die like your friend. If you betray our trust, your death will be slower. I looked at the dying climber. She was unconscious now, breathing shallow and rapid. There was nothing more I could do for her here. I started rappelling down the cliff as storm clouds swirled around me and ancient guardians watched from above. The descent should have killed me. With the storm raging and the Thunderbirds circling overhead, rappelling 800 feet of limestone cliff in near-zero visibility was beyond dangerous. But every time I slipped or lost my way, the wind would shift and guide me back to the correct route. They wanted me alive long enough to complete the task. I made it to the bottom, just as the worst of the storm hit. Rain came down in sheets, and lightning turned the forest into a strobing nightmare. But I knew where Tommy would have hidden anything important. Our old base camp was half a mile from the cliff, tucked into a grove of ancient oaks that provided natural shelter. We'd used it for years as a staging area for multi-day climbs. Tommy had carved a small cache into the base of the largest tree, a waterproof hiding spot where we kept emergency supplies and backup gear. I found the tree by memory and feel. Rain washing the hair into my eyes and making every root a potential ankle breaker. The cache was still there, sealed with the same military surplus container we'd used for a decade. Inside were Tommy's photos. 3 rolls of developed film, each frame showing details of the Thunderbird nesting cave. The eggs were clearly visible, along with measurements Tommy had taken and notes about their electromagnetic properties. He documented everything: pictographs, bone arrangements, even close-up shots of individual Thunderbird feathers. The last photo on the final roll showed Tommy himself, grinning at the camera with one of the eggs in the background. He'd set up a self-timer to document his discovery. The expression on his face was pure excitement. He thought he'd found the proof that would revolutionize cryptozoology. Instead, he'd signed his own death warrant. I was about to destroy the photos when I heard his voice again. "Don't do it, David." I turned around and there was Tommy again. Still looked solid, still looked real. But this time I could see through him to the trees behind. "These photos are proof," he said. "Evidence that the old stories are true. You can't just destroy scientific discovery because some overgrown birds want to keep secrets." "You died for these pictures," I said. "The Thunderbirds killed you for violating their sacred space." "I died because I wasn't prepared," Tommy replied. "But you could be different. You could study them properly, with respect. Think of what we could learn." Lightning flashed overhead, and for a second I saw the truth. This wasn't Tommy's spirit trying to guide me. It was something else, something that wanted me to break my promise to the Thunderbirds. "You're not Tommy," I said. The false image smiled, and its eyes went black as storm clouds. "Smart boy, your friend's spirit moved on years ago, but his regrets linger, and regrets can be useful." I looked closer at the photos, using my flashlight to examine details I'd missed. In several shots there was something else in the cave, a 4th egg, smaller than the others and cracked open, empty. "One of them hatched," the false Tommy said. "A young Thunderbird, learning to hunt. That's what killed the climbing team. That's what will come for you if you destroy the only evidence of their existence." But I understood now. The adult Thunderbirds weren't just protecting their current nest, they were protecting their young one, teaching it to guard the sacred sites. The recent attacks weren't random violence, they were training. "The photos stay destroyed," I said, pulling out my lighter. The false Tommy dropped all pretense of being human. It grew taller, its features shifting into something with too many teeth and eyes that reflected light like a predator's. "You're making a mistake," it hissed. "Those creatures will never let you leave this forest alive. I'm offering you a way out. Take the photos to the authorities, prove their existence. Force them into the open where they can be studied and controlled." I lit the lighter and held the flame to the first roll of film. It caught immediately, burning hot and fast. The false Tommy screamed, actually screamed as the photos turned to ash. That's when the young Thunderbird attacked. It came out of the storm like a living bolt of lightning, talons extended and eyes blazing with electrical fire. This one was smaller than the adults, maybe a 15-foot wingspan, but it moved faster and more aggressively. It was hunting me specifically. Drawn by the scent of the burning photos, I rolled away as talons raked the ground where I'd been standing. The creature wheeled around for another pass, and I got my first clear look at it. It was magnificent and terrifying, perfectly adapted for aerial combat, with electromagnetic organs that let it control lightning like a weapon. Lightning struck the tree beside me, close enough to singe my hair. The young Thunderbird was learning to use its powers, but it wasn't precise yet. That gave me a chance. I sprinted for the cliff face, burning photos clutched in my hand. The creature followed, calling to its parents in the old language. Answering calls came from above. The adults were coming to help their offspring. At the base of Devil's Backbone, I found what I was looking for, a narrow crack that led into the limestone cave system. It was barely wide enough for a human, too small for even a young Thunderbird. I squeezed inside just as talons scraped the rock behind me. The caves were pitch black and filled with the sound of underground rivers. I followed the main passage by feel, still clutching the burning photos. Behind me, I could hear the young Thunderbird trying to force its way into the crack, frustrated by the limitation of its size. The passage opened into a larger chamber, and suddenly I wasn't alone. Ancient Cherokee petroglyphs covered every surface, and in the center of the chamber was a traditional altar stones arranged in sacred patterns, offerings of corn and tobacco that looked fresh. Joseph Flying Hawk had been here recently. "You came," said a voice from the shadows. Flying Hawk stepped into the dim light of my flashlight. He was wearing traditional Cherokee clothing and carrying a medicine bundle that hummed with its own electrical energy. "I felt the awakening," he said. "Felt the thunderbirds stirring when the first climbers disturbed the nesting grounds. I've been preparing for this moment." "They want me to destroy these photos," I said, holding up the burning remains. "Evidence that Tommy took before they killed him." Flying Hawk nodded. "Your friend thought he could take their secrets without consequence. The thunderbirds are older than human civilization, David. They were here when the first Cherokee climbed these cliffs, and they'll be here long after we're gone. Some knowledge is too dangerous for the modern world. But if people knew they existed, people would try to capture them, study them, turn them into weapons or tourist attractions." Flying Hawk interrupted. "The thunderbirds guard more than just their nesting grounds. They're the keepers of balance between the natural and supernatural worlds. Exposing them would shatter that balance." The sound of frustrated screeching echoed from the passage entrance. The young thunderbird was calling for help. "You have to choose," Flying Hawk said. "Complete the destruction of those photos and accept the responsibility of becoming a guardian yourself, or try to escape with the evidence and spend the rest of your short life running from creatures that control the weather itself." I looked at the last few photos in my hand, clear images of the thunderbird eggs, undeniable proof of their existence. Tommy had died for these pictures. Part of me wanted to preserve them, to honor his sacrifice by sharing his discovery with the world. But I thought about the peaceful expressions on the faces of the dead climbers, and I knew what I had to do. I dropped the remaining photos into the sacred fire that burned at the center of Flying Hawk's altar. They caught immediately, curling and blackening as Tommy's final evidence turned to smoke. The moment the last photo was destroyed, the screeching stopped. The young thunderbird's frustrated calls turned into something that almost sounded like approval. Flying Hawk smiled. "Now you understand the real responsibility. Not just protecting people from the thunderbirds, but protecting the thunderbirds from people." Thunder rumbled overhead, but it sounded different now, less angry, more accepting. The storm was beginning to pass. "Can I leave?" I asked. "You can leave the caves," Flying Hawk said, "but you'll never really leave this place behind. The thunderbirds have accepted you as a guardian. That's a lifetime obligation." I understood what he meant. I'd seen too much, learned too much to ever go back to my old life. The Cherokee blood in my veins carried responsibilities I'd never acknowledged before. We made our way back through the cave system to the surface. The storm was clearing, and the first stars were becoming visible through breaking clouds. At the entrance, Flying Hawk handed me a small leather pouch. "Traditional offerings," he said. "Corn, tobacco, sage. Leave some at the base of the cliff every full moon. They'll know you're keeping faith with the old agreements." I took the pouch and nodded. In the distance, I could see massive shapes circling the peak of Raven's Roost, the adult thunderbirds, returning to their nest with their young one safely in tow. They'd be watching me for the rest of my life, making sure I kept their secrets. But somehow, that didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like coming home. The official report listed the climbing team as victims of severe weather conditions. 4 experienced climbers caught in an unexpected electrical storm, struck by lightning while attempting to reach safety. It happens more often than people think in these mountains. I filed the paperwork with steady hands and answered all the investigators' questions. Yes, I'd found evidence of the climbing team on the cliff face. No, there was nothing to suggest foul play or equipment failure. The storm had been unusually violent, with documented wind speeds exceeding 80 miles per hour and over 200 lightning strikes in the immediate area. The investigators bought it completely. Why wouldn't they? I was a 13-year veteran with an exemplary service record and detailed knowledge of the terrain. When I said a storm had killed those climbers, that's what went in the official record. 6 months later, I was promoted to senior ranger for the Raven's Roost district. My new responsibilities included managing climbing permits, conducting safety briefings, and maintaining the cultural sensitivity protocols for Cherokee sacred sites. What it really meant was that I became the gatekeeper. Every climbing permit application for Raven's Roost crosses my desk. I review the proposed routes, the experience levels, the weather windows. Most applications get approved without issue. The standard routes are safe enough, and the Thunderbirds don't mind respectful visitors who stick to designated areas. But some applications get denied. The ones that propose new route explorations near the 700-foot level. The ones from climbers with histories of trophy hunting or specimen collection. The ones that mention cameras capable of infrared photography or electromagnetic detection equipment. Those permits get lost in bureaucratic delays until the applicants give up and go elsewhere. Joseph Flying Hawk and I meet every full moon at the base of Devil's Backbone. We leave the traditional offerings and check for any signs of disturbance. Sometimes we hear the calls of the Thunderbirds echoing off the cliff face, not angry now, but acknowledging. They know we're keeping faith with the old agreements. Flying Hawk has been teaching me the Cherokee language and the traditional protocols for dealing with sacred sites. My grandmother's blood carries more responsibility than I ever realized. There are dozens of places in these mountains where the boundary between worlds grows thin, and all of them need guardians who understand both the old ways and the modern world. The young Thunderbird has grown larger in the past 3 years. I catch glimpses of it sometimes during my patrols, a massive shadow moving through storm clouds, practicing the ancient art of weather control. It's learning to be more subtle than its first aggressive attacks. The recent freak weather incidents that have discouraged several climbing groups from attempting dangerous routes aren't as random as they appear. Tommy's gear turned up in a routine equipment check, stored in a forgotten locker at park headquarters. I disposed of it quietly, making sure no evidence of his final climb remained. The official record still lists his death as an equipment failure during severe weather. His family never questioned it. Sometimes I dream about that day on the cliff. I see Tommy's face in the storm clouds, hear his voice in the wind through the limestone passages. But I know it's not really him. Tommy's spirit moved on long ago, free from the regrets that tried to trap me into making his same mistake. The false entity that tried to trick me into preserving the photos hasn't appeared again. Maybe destroying the evidence weakened it, or maybe it just moved on to easier targets. There are always people willing to exploit the supernatural for personal gain. Last week, a documentary crew applied for permits to film at Raven's Roost. They wanted to investigate unexplained electrical phenomena and possible cryptozoological activity in the area. Their application mentioned bringing electromagnetic detection equipment and high-altitude drones. Their permit was denied due to environmental protection concerns during nesting season. The crew leader called to argue, but I explained that Cherokee cultural sensitivity protocols took precedence over documentary filming. He threatened to go over my head to the district supervisor, but the complaint never materialized. Funny how cell phone calls seem to drop when people try to make them from certain areas near the cliff. These mountains hold older secrets than most people can imagine. The Thunderbirds are just one example of powers that predate human civilization. There are things in these hills that would shatter the worldview of anyone who encountered them unprepared. My job isn't just to protect visitors from natural hazards anymore. It's to protect the balance between worlds, to make sure that some doors stay closed and some secrets stay hidden. The Cherokee understood this responsibility for centuries. Now it's my turn to carry the burden. Every full moon, I make my offerings at the base of Raven's Roost. Every time storm clouds gather around the cliff face, I know the guardians are watching. And every time someone applies for a climbing permit that would take them too close to places they shouldn't go, I make sure they find other mountains to explore. The Thunderbirds still nest in the heights of Raven's Roost. Their young still learn to hunt and guard the sacred places. And I still patrol these forests, keeping the peace between the two. The world people think they know, and the world that really exists. Some responsibilities choose you. You don't get to walk away from them just because they're dangerous or difficult to explain. The Cherokee have a saying, "We do not inherit the land from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children." I'm learning that applies to more than just the physical landscape. Some truths are too powerful for any one generation to handle. They have to be protected, passed down carefully to those who can bear the weight of keeping them. The mountains remember everything, and now, so do I.